أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا فيك، شلونك؟
شرفتنا.
الشرف إلي.
شكرا. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for attending this. I will start recording this event. So if you, I think you are all have put your cameras off. So if you don't feel comfortable to put your camera on, keep it off because we are recording this event. Let me start recording. Okay, hello everyone. I am Omar Mohammed, a historian from Mosul and known until recently as the founder of Mosul Eye blog, which was a blog set up in Mosul to report what was happening in the city of Mosul under the rule of the so-called Islamic State. I am currently living in exile in Paris. I can never complain about Paris, although the situation is completely different now. But I have continued my work as a teacher now of Middle East history as well as cultural heritage diplomacy. And that's why I invited today a very special guest who has been in the headlines of the Iraqi Twitter and the Iraqi newspapers for his direct communication, both in Arabic and in English, about culture, about art, about music, about his preference of books, the books he reads, and he kind of like started setting up this kind of direct communication between the population of the host country and the ambassador of a foreign country like Canada. With us today is Ambassador Orlik Shannon. He is a Canadian diplomat specialized in the Arab and Muslim world. Does this make you an Orientalist?
Well, that expression is loaded with a lot of history and a lot of pejorative meanings, so I'm always careful about using that term. But yes, I have an affinity and an affection for this region.
Perfect. He studied conflict zone security sector programming, and he has advanced Arabic. He is an advanced Arabic linguist. Recently was on leave from the Canadian government at assisting Syrians in the liberated areas as a country manager for ARK, a stabilization consultancy and programming implementer. He served as Canada's Consul General in Istanbul between 2016 and 19, and he was appointed as the Canada's ambassador to Iraq in a very critical time of the modern history of Iraq in October 2019. Welcome, Mr. Shannon, with us. Our discussion will focus only on the cultural diplomacy, but the digital cultural diplomacy. I was reading the report from the Senate House of Canada, which was held in June 2019. They were establishing new rules that cultural diplomacy should be at the front lines of Canada's foreign policy and foreign diplomacy. However, there were also some concerns among the Senate that Canada is not doing enough digital cultural diplomacy, as we know that the digital diplomacy and the technology in general is taking over even our minor details of our daily life. How do you define this kind of change in the public diplomacy and this very quick and sudden shift from what we know it as the old school or old-fashioned diplomacy, that is, it requires lots of exchange of letters in order to meet with an ambassador, in order to meet with his deputy, but now you can easily click on his direct message on Twitter and ask him to hold a meeting, just like we did with this one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Omar, and thank you for all of your students who are joining us. I'm very, very honored by the invitation. Look, I think, you know, as diplomats, we're always asking ourselves, you know, what is the relevance of our role in the year 2020? Obviously, embassies and ambassadors have been around since the Middle Ages. But the world is changing and technology is changing. And, you know, one of the realities now is that heads of state communicate directly. I mean, our foreign minister speaks to a number of his counterparts by WhatsApp, right? So it used to be that embassies played the role of being the facilitator in communication between governments. And more that role isn't as essential as before, because with technology, ministers can speak directly. And so it's up to us to find new ways to redefine our role. And I think, you know, that had already begun for me, at least, as someone who's really focused on the Middle East. You know, one of the things that I took away from the Arab Spring was that we all collectively failed to see that coming. And I would argue that, you know, the governments in the Arab world failed to see it coming. They didn't anticipate that this change would come. And it's particularly bad that, you know, embassies of Western countries in the Arab world, you know, failed to detect this movement that was coming, even though evidence for it had been around for many, many years. I mean, I remember I was in Cairo as a diplomat from 2004 to 2006. And I used to, you know, deal with the Kifaya movement at the time. It was the early movement, the early start of this protest movement. And I certainly didn't predict that, you know, in less than 7 years, that movement would topple the Mubarak government. And I think part of the reason why we've often missed some of these signals of change is because embassies have gotten very comfortable dealing with a circle of elites, you know, who tend to congregate around the embassies, and they tend to be the ones who speak our language, and they're easy to deal with because, you know, it doesn't force us to step outside our comfort zone and to engage in different languages. And so I think that has really brought home for me the need for us to be able to speak to different audiences, not just, as you said, not just the exchange of diplomatic notes, not just the formalities of interaction between governments, but interacting with people as well, including people who are not in power, because those people may find themselves in power quite quickly because this region changes very, very quickly. So I think the definition of what is our audience has changed and it's evolving. And I think the idea of having communication with people and not just governments has become more and more important. And we can talk about, and I'm happy to talk about the techniques that we use and things like that. But I think, you know, the era of COVID also has really stressed how, you know, again, the traditional ways of doing things don't necessarily work in a crisis. And so I'm especially happy that I had already begun to put in place, you know, a platform for engaging with the Iraqi public, you know, shortly after I arrived in Baghdad. And that was especially critical when, you know, in January we had a crisis in the security situation. It made it very difficult for me to get outside of Baghdad and even in Baghdad. And then COVID hit in March. And, you know, from that point, it was really difficult to have in-person meetings. And so I'm, you know, really happy that I had the foresight, I guess, to have already started building this virtual platform of engagement, because it's been invaluable to me in the last, you know, 8-10 months, when that's all we have now. Now we won't always have COVID, but I think getting used to having, you know, alternate means to engage directly with people, that's always going to be valuable. And so that's one of the lessons certainly that I've taken from this year.
Thank you. That was a great insight. Mr. Ambassador, I am one of your followers, and I have seen your, as you mentioned, your direct interaction with people who might not even be, not to mention that they are not in a governmental level, etc., etc. They are ordinary people, and Twitter is becoming the most active platform for diplomats to act on culture and cultural diplomacy. Does this make it a problem for the foreign policy that a diplomat is interacting this way directly with the people from the host country? Does this make it like difficult for your foreign policy to communicate with the host country on the governmental level?
I would say it varies, right, from country to country. So, for example, I think you may be aware, you know, we had a real problem with Saudi Arabia a few years ago when There was a tweet that was put out by our foreign minister. It was amplified or retweeted locally by our embassy, and it caused, you know, a crisis in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, it's very different because for us here, we're a new player in a sense. You know, we didn't have an embassy here before 2014. We didn't have a resident ambassador in Baghdad before 2018. And so we're kind of starting from zero almost. And one of the objectives that I was given when I came out here was to make sure that people understood how much we're doing in Iraq. Because at the moment, Iraq is one of our priority countries in the Middle East. And that dates back a few years, and it was in response to Daesh. So, you know, we came to Iraq and to Syria to help fight Daesh, to achieve the territorial defeat of Daesh, and then to help stabilize Iraq so that that problem does not recur. And so we're heavily involved in, you know, humanitarian assistance in the liberated areas, stabilization efforts in the liberated areas, development. We're trying to raise the level of trade. And we're, you know, engaging much more now diplomatically as well, both in Baghdad and in Erbil with the Kurdish region. And you know, and we're spending a lot of money doing that. And that's not necessarily well understood by Canadians or by Iraqis. So I was given an objective when I came, you know, to make sure that Iraqis understand that, you know, we're really, you know, among the most significant investors in Iraq at the moment. You know, we're the #1 bilateral humanitarian donor, and most people don't know that. And there's also, you know, frankly, because we're not very well known here, there's a lot of mythology, right? So there's a lot of Iraqis who, you know, they associate us with the United States. You know, they think that we're close geopolitically. And so many Iraqis think that we were part of the invasion in 2003. And so I'm still, you know, even now on Twitter, I keep saying, no, we refuse to participate in the 2003 invasion. And people are like, oh, really? I didn't understand. I didn't know that. So just explaining ourselves, our history, you know, why we're here, how our interests are maybe different from, you know, some of our other allies, and our history is very, very different. Again, as I said, that's one of my objectives. So I've been given, I think, fairly broad leeway to engage with the public. So I feel, you know, I've got the confidence of my government to come, and because they know I speak Arabic, I think they trust that I'll engage appropriately with local audiences. So certainly in Iraq, I think it's been, you know, a measured success so far.
That's great. I mean, on this note, on clarifying Canada to the Iraqis, because an essential part of the culture of diplomacy is to establish a communication, clear communication between your country and the host country on the topics of culture, the cultural exchange, the intellectual exchange, etc. And one would expect an ambassador to promote only his cultural elements, while you, as a Canadian ambassador who has this advanced degree in Arabic, you always brag about reading Arabic books, and you promote the Arabic books, you promote the Arabic intellectual productions. Is this important in the digital age, that you gain the trust of the people by saying, like, I am not only promoting my culture, I am also interested in your culture? Do you think that the future of our communication, if you are probably going to be an ambassador in another country in different terms, do you think that it's essential to have this element of speaking the Arabic language in the time that it's easy to communicate without knowing even the language? There are many good translators online, but it's still the human side is there.
It's funny you asked that question, because I have this argument all the time with people in my own diplomatic service, you know, among my colleagues, because I very much believe in the importance of the languages, and you know, for us it's expensive and it takes a lot of time, and you have to really put in the effort to learn, you know, to master a difficult language. And I sometimes, you know, encounter colleagues, you know, including other ambassadors, who say, you know, it's nice to have the language, but it's not essential, right? Because we have local staff who can interpret in meetings, and you know, the foreign ministry works in English, and so, you know, we can translate the diplomatic notes, but you know, a junior person can do that, and that's good enough. And my answer has always been, it's not about the operational aspect, because yeah, you can function, you know, through interpretation. Although I've always found that, you know, because I'm able to understand interpretation in meetings, I find 40% of the content gets lost. You know, the nuance gets lost in interpretation. So already I'm not convinced of how effective a tool that is. But the bigger issue for me is it's more about your credibility, right? So you're just seen differently if you're seen as someone who, you know, has never spent much time in the region, doesn't especially know the country. I think the language tells you a lot about the person, you know, that they've made the effort to learn. And if they know the language, they probably know the culture pretty well. And I think that's important. It's probably important in most areas of the world, but I think it's especially important in Iraq because, you know, this is a country that was traumatized by history, obviously. And you know, the history of the international presence in Iraq after 2003 is a very difficult one because, you know, it was a period of occupation, which then transitioned into a more normal, you know, assistance relationship. But then we all had to come back, you know, in 2014 to fight Daesh. And here we are, we're still trying to help, you know, Iraq stabilize itself without being patronizing and without being, you know, seen as imposing our agendas and our values. And Iraqis, for good reason, are extremely proud people. And so if you engage from the perspective of having lessons to give, and you do that without any humility, and you make it clear that you don't really understand the culture and haven't made the effort to learn it and don't think it's important, then how effective will you be as a diplomat when you talk about your values? Whereas I don't assume that everything I say is necessarily accepted at face value, but I think people understand that I'm here because I want to be here. I love this country and what I've seen of it, which is frankly is not enough. But I'm very much engaging with people as an equal, I hope, and showing that, you know, I'm proud of the culture that I represent and the values that come with that, but I'm also here to learn. I mean, Iraq has a history that is much deeper than Canada's. We're a very young country. We've made, I think, a success of ourselves, but it's still early in the story. And interestingly, I think there's a lot that we have in common. You know, you don't think of Canada and Iraq as countries that have a lot in common. And I don't just mean that we're the number 5 and number 6 oil producers in the world, but we're also, you know, we're also the product of multiple founding cultures, right? So obviously here in Iraq, you have not only the religious differences between Shias and Sunnis, but you have the Kurdish element as well. And in a way, it almost replicates a bit the situation in Canada where you have the founding, you know, French speaking, you know, people, the Anglophone, English speaking, and the First Nations people as well. And we've had to, it's not an exact duplicate. And, you know, I'm Quebecois myself. I'm from the French speaking part of Canada. My first language was French. And so I see a lot of those similarities about, you know, how do you make a minority function within a bigger federation? And how do you ensure that rights are respected? And how do you honor the role, the historical role and the debt that is owed to the native peoples? These are all issues that aren't foreign in Iraq. In fact, they're central to the discussion about Iraq's future. So again, I feel like I'm able to engage on those issues from a standpoint of humility, saying that we still have a lot to learn in Canada. Maybe we have elements of our model that are successful. I would never say they can be exported to Iraq, but we can have a conversation about, is it a relevant model and what can Iraqis learn in turn from Canada?
Mr. Ambassador, in this time of like very fast tracking movement of tweets and words, there are many challenges, especially on Twitter, that Twitter doesn't give the option to edit the tweet. And sometimes a mistake that intentionally put on Twitter could create a major problem. Also, deleting the tweet would not be enough because there are thousands of people who are putting like the account of a certain ambassador or a personality or a public figure on the seafarers, and they will do a screenshot directly, and the tweet goes viral. So I will not mention the example here that happened in Iraq, but there was a tweet from a group of diplomats in Iraq that actually created a problem in Iraq. I mean, based on this experience, will this make the ambassadors, the diplomats of foreign countries in a host country think carefully before they tweet anything? Do they make big efforts before they like, is this going to be right? Is this going to be perceived correctly, wrong? Like it's making your task a very difficult one.
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, you have to be really careful here. It's a very sensitive environment, and I'm always struck by, again, the tone I find of social media in Iraq is often very harsh. I find people are harsh with each other. There's not a lot of space to make a mistake. Now, fortunately, I think I've avoided so far making a really bad one. But you know, something as simple as I sent a message out. I think it was at the start of Muharram, where I used the word ihtifal, right? So the celebration, right? So to me, it was I was you know taking note of the celebration of this holiday. But of course, for people who mark Muharram, it's not a celebration, right? It's a sad occasion. So again, the intention was correct. The word choice was wrong. I don't think people perceived it as offensive, but they pointed it out to me that, you know, you might have missed a nuance there. And so on that one, I corrected it, and no one had any, you know, any issues. But yeah, I mean, you have to be really careful. And again, I write my own tweets always, whether it's in English or in Arabic. And I think people expect now that, you know, I might make a mistake, and it's well-intentioned, and it might be about a bad word choice, but it's never about the sentiment being, you know, in any way disrespectful of people. And so, but no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, you know, we need to be careful in this environment. It was especially, you know, difficult earlier this spring when, you know, you had a new government of Prime Minister Kadhimi. You know, he was in his first days, and, you know, the last thing that someone like that needs is a fresh controversy sparked by Western embassies. I mean, we're all here, you know, to support him and to support his government. So yeah, I think it's very much upon us to be responsible and to show good judgment. But at the same time, what I don't want is to become so scared of reactions that might be negative that then, you know, you don't say anything, because then you really miss a lot of the value of having a dialogue that's open, that's unguarded. And so for me, I'm willing to take the risk of making a mistake. And I just hope that people forgive me for my mistakes and again, accept that I do it with good intentions.
Is Canada going to export maple to Iraq?
It's funny you say that. So maple syrup obviously is one of the products that we're well known for. And so I've been trying to figure out a way that I can introduce it to Iraqis. And so I'm thinking of doing another video. So I did a cooking demonstration with Klecha a few months ago, which people really liked. And for that one, I was promoting canola, which is a Canadian cooking oil. And so I'm thinking for the next one, I might do a cooking demonstration using maple syrup and then urge people to give it a try. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing where, you know, I mean, people had a funny reaction the last time. Some thought it was very, you know, charming. But others said, oh, you're just trying to, you know, sell Canadian products. And my reaction was, of course I am. That's part of my job. You know, of course I'm a salesman for my country. We're trying to develop a commercial program in Iraq because, you know, again, we have, you know, a big business community in Canada. I think they don't know this market at all. I think the market scares them, you know, because, you know, the press coverage of Iraq is generally negative, unfortunately. And so, you know, trying to create demand in Iraq for Canadian products, it just gives us something else to talk about. That's not always politics. And again, if it can, you know, give an opportunity for us to highlight our Iraqi Canadian community as well. So these are people who've, you know, established themselves in Canada. They've become Canadians. You know, many have gotten into habits that we enjoy in Canada, whether it's our winter sports or whether it's maple syrup. So, you know, what would be more brilliant than if I could, you know, do a video with an Iraqi Canadian who's become, you know, an expert at making pancakes with maple syrup, right? So that's the sort of thing, again, it sounds, you know, something really simple and innocent, but it can actually lead you into having some really interesting cross-cultural experiences. So that's a long way of answering the question, what do I plan to do with maple syrup? I hope to do something that has, you know, a public diplomacy component, a commercial diplomacy component, and we'll see what I'm able to pull off.
Yeah, this is where where cultural diplomacy can serve the business sector. Mr. Ambassador, there is before we go to the activities of Canada in Iraq, one of the challenges again in the cultural diplomacy in the digital age, and it's a very old issue, but still a very big issue in the relation and communication between countries. That is the looted artifacts. The legislations in different countries differs as the countries themselves have their own regulations, their own rules, their own legislations, etc. Canada has been recently criticized for not having tough legislations against the looted artifacts, especially on the online markets. And Iraq is one of the countries that, one of the most countries that affected by looted artifacts, and Iraq is still reclaiming this. And I think the cultural diplomacy, especially in the digital age, is one of the ways to create this kind of collaboration between Iraq and Canada, and to seek new ways to end, or at least to modify this kind of what they call it, not tough legislations, that it gives the looters a space to sell their looted materials. How is this affecting the relation between Iraq and Canada?
So it isn't, and I'll tell you why. I was interested when you raised that point with me, and I investigated it because it wasn't a topic that I was, an expert on. And so I tried to track, where did this criticism come from originally? And it turns out there was a presentation at a conference, I think in Hanoi a couple of years ago, and there was an Israeli expert who made this comment that, Canada was a weak link in the global, effort to interdict smuggling of artifacts. And apparently I'm told by my colleagues in Ottawa that, they followed up with Israel and said, what are you talking about? Like, do you have examples to give us? Because we're not aware of any. And we never got an answer from the Israeli official. But looking at our laws, so we've signed all of the relevant UNESCO conventions, including the 1970 convention, which is the key one. And what our legislation does is it obligates us to return, stolen artifacts, stolen from any country that is a signatory of the same convention. And so what that means is, in the case like Israel, for example, Israel is not a signatory of the 1970 convention. So theoretically, you could have an artifact that was stolen from Israel and then, imported illegally to Canada, and we would not have a legal mechanism to return it because they're not signatories. In the case of Iraq, it doesn't apply because Iraq is a signatory of that 1970 convention. So, so in fact, when a number of countries, after the rise of Daesh, started updating their legislation to address this problem of the looting of Iraqi artifacts, we found that we didn't have to make any changes to our laws because they were sufficiently strong. And in fact, in March of last year, 2019, we returned 2 modern art paintings by an Iraqi artist, which had been looted from the Baghdad Fine Arts College in 2003, and which had been imported illegally into Canada in 2015. So that's the only example that I'm aware of where a theft was detected in Canada and where the goods were returned. So, so at the moment, we feel that actually we're not a weak link in the chain. We feel that our laws are strong enough. And certainly there's never been any suggestion that I'm aware of from the Iraqi government that there's any unresolved cases, involving Canada. But if anyone has information to the contrary, please let me know and I'll investigate.
Thank you. I was just made aware today that Canada is contributing to the UNESCO activities in Iraq within the counterterrorism education and many other activities that I didn't have actually the time to search because this was a very late information that I received. Could you elaborate more on the UNESCO-Canada collaboration in Iraq?
So, I mean, we're one of the key donors to UNESCO globally. So I think our contribution last year was something like $3.5 million. We've also contributed $200,000 to what's called the Heritage Emergency Fund, which is the fund that UNESCO uses for rapid interventions when, precisely as in the case of Daesh, you know, when there are cultural artifacts that are you know, in the process of being destroyed or looted, for example. It's a fund that can react quickly. So we're a contributor to that. I would say that, I mean, in the Mosul area, which is the area that you're from and that we care about so much, I would say actually our key partner there is the UNDP. So we are one of the three main shareholders in what's called the Funding Facility for Stabilization, which is rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure in Mosul, including the Mosul Library, which is one of the projects that I'm particularly interested in, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. So, so yeah, I would say we're not, I'm not aware of a specific UNESCO project in Iraq that we're directly funding. I know that the French and the Germans and the EU delegation are actively involved with it. But again, a lot of what we do is adjoining, you know, UNESCO's interest. And so we're certainly open to cooperating with them directly in the future.
The cultural centers, the physical cultural centers might seem old school now, because I mean, we know that in every country, any embassy would have a cultural center. And Canada has one in Turkey, in Cairo, just like the other European embassies and cultural centers. We know that one of the most important cultural centers in Middle East is the Netherlands center. Canada is moving toward taking a step to establish deeper cultural collaboration with Iraq, or is this still a step that hasn't been considered yet?
So first, I'll have to correct you, because we actually don't have cultural centers in Cairo or in Turkey. And in fact, you know, I think that's a real deficiency in Canada's approach. You know, we've never adopted the UK model, for example, of the British Council, or the French model of the Institut Français. And, you know, which means that, you know, on the one hand, you know, there's a benefit, I think, to having physical spaces that, that you can welcome people in and that you can use to have cultural exchanges with. On the other hand, in a sense, it's a model that's not particularly well adapted to the reality of 2020. You know, unfortunately, diplomats increasingly are targets of violence. And so even a facility like that, that is associated with a Western country could be targeted. I mean, that's just the reality that we inhabit. And obviously now with COVID, you know, we have just a real difficulty in having face-to-face interactions with people. So I think, you know, the future is probably more in the area of virtual, you know, collaboration, having collaborative spaces online and things like that. I think, I mean, in terms of what we're doing in Iraq, you know, we're probably at the maximum limit of what the government of Canada will do, because again, for us, we've identified Iraq as a priority country in the sort of post-Daesh stabilization timeframe. But, you know, our long-term ambitions here are not to have the government be, you know, funding billions of dollars in efforts, because we look at Iraq, you know, it's a middle-income country. Despite all of the challenges around governance and corruption and things like that, it's still a government in a country that shouldn't be a recipient of aid because it's wealthy enough not to be. And so what we aspire to in Iraq is to have that kind of, you know, temporary stabilization rule be replaced by something that is much more built on people-to-people linkages, on commercial partnerships and things like that, where it shouldn't be the government of Canada and, you know, putting taxpayer money into the equation to kind of build this relationship. So what I'm looking forward to doing, hopefully, is again to develop those people-to-people partnerships to try to activate the role of the Iraqi Canadian community, which is, it's not massive, but, you know, we're talking about 40, 50,000 people who still have, you know, strong linkages back home and who aren't especially active in terms of promoting exchanges. I'd like to develop institutional linkages as well between universities and think tanks and things like that. And again, you know, I think my role is to be a catalyst and to try to facilitate those linkages. If there are gaps, yeah, we can probably put a bit of money to try to fill the gap. but over time, those partnerships need to become, organic and self-sustaining. So that's what I'm looking at. And so I think there's a lot that we can do in the future. And again, Mosul is a good example of a place where, before I arrived, we didn't have a specific project in mind. Whereas I've identified the Mosul Library as a partner that I'd like to work with, and would like to connect again with people back in Canada who, either have the money themselves or have, institutional capabilities that they can contribute. And if I can facilitate those partnerships, and then, we can step away and let those things happen without necessarily having the government of Canada have to play a hand-holding role.
We have actually received some books and postcards from Canada within our campaign, Revive the Library of Mosul, the initiative we established with Mosul Eye in 2017. Only few books, but we still hope to get more books. Mr. Ambassador, we know that the digital age is giving us many important and effective tools to make our life easier. But at the same time, it has been argued, especially by Western countries, especially by the EU, that the online platforms, specifically the social media, has been a tool also to undermine democracy. How is this challenge met in Canada? How is Canada, with its foreign policy, is adapting itself to the future major challenge of its democracy might be undermined by the digital tools?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And it is something that we consider a threat. And in fact, before our last elections, we had elections last October 2019, we identified serious efforts on the part of foreign states to interfere in our election through various online, manipulations and campaigns and things like that. So it's been identified as a threat to our democratic system in Canada. I think there's no doubt that we're seeing certain countries invest more and more of their resources in these disruptive activities. And of course, the irony is that those are some of the same tools that democracy activists need in many countries where they are facing challenges, trying to ensure accountable government in increasingly authoritarian and autocratic states. So, I think how we're addressing it, first of all, is we're talking about it openly, and we are candid about it. We've formed various diplomatic alliances with other countries that we sort of loosely refer to it as the rules-based international order. So the idea that there are basic rules of the road that are required to protect representative government, and so more and more you're seeing Canada joining with other countries like the UK, sometimes Germany, others, in making joint statements. So more and more we talk about the decline of democratic values, in Europe and in other countries, and we do it collectively, so that it's not just one of us speaking out, because then it's a lot easier to be targeted, right, by some of these malevolent actors and countries. So, and we're also spending quite a bit of money to educate Canadians on the online threat. We're attacking the problem of fake news with, again, information tools to help people show a bit of better judgment in identifying, what is the legitimate news source and what is propaganda and what is foreign-backed propaganda. But it's an ongoing effort. I think it's still early days. And again, we're keen to learn from the experience of a number of other countries that have faced this threat. I'm thinking of Ukraine and many other countries that are really being challenged with disinformation campaigns and propaganda.
Mr. Ambassador, I have been communicating with Iraqi diplomats and as well as Iraqi officials, including the head of the state, Mr. Dr. Barham Saleh, the Iraqi president. And there is this kind of developing and growing interest in we had cultural diplomacy in Iraq, but we want to reintroduce this cultural diplomacy, and we want to learn from such kind of experiences. That was one of the main reasons why I was really interested in your experience, and also to answer one of the responses to the event when I posted it first, that invite normal people, why you are inviting the ambassador? Then my response is, we are also normal people. The ambassador is communicating with normal people. That makes him normal. But my request here, I hope it's not challenging, is I have met with many young Iraqi diplomats working in Europe and in other countries, and they are seeking the expertise, they are seeking the knowledge in this field. And I hope that you can speak something in Arabic to them in 2 minutes, no more.
ايه اكيد اكيد.
On how, on what, where to start. I will ask the question in English, I tell you in English, but you can answer it in Arabic. Is where to start as a young diplomat in this very challenging age of digital age, and we don't know how it's going to be in the next few years. So they have to be prepared.
Yeah. يعني ليست من الانصاف أنا بالعربية وما
Yes, I want to apologize to the audience who do not speak Arabic. He is going to speak in Arabic because he is going to address the young Iraqi diplomats. Thank you.
يعني ما كنت أتوقع هذه الفرصة يا عمر.
I'm sorry.
وليس من الإنصاف يعني لجميع الطلاب اللي ما بيتحدثوا العربية.
I will translate to them.
That's very kind of you. يعني شو بدك أقول لهم؟
نصيحة and advice.
إيه يعني لا شك إنه للعراق يعني تاريخ طويل وعريق، وهناك الكثير يعني من الممكن لنا أن نستفيد من خبرتكم. يعني ما في داعي للخجل، يعني عبروا عن أنفسكم بفخر، لأنه يعني كل ما يدور حول العراق ليس سلبي، بس هناك يعني إيجابيات كذلك. يعني يمكن أن نتحدث مثلا عن حتى الفن الثوري اللي شاهدناه في السنة الماضية. يعني انظر إلى هؤلاء الشباب الجرآن اللي طلعوا في الشوارع يعني واللي طالبوا باحترام حقوقهم. يعني هذا شيء داعي للفخر.
شكرا جزيلا.
عفوا.
Thank you. What he said is that for those who didn't understand Arabic, he said that Iraqis should be proud of their history. They should express themselves freely. They shouldn't be afraid of expressing themselves. He also referred to the October 2019 uprising in Iraq, which is known as October Uprising. It was a beautiful movement, a youth movement that it was political protest, but it was represented by art, that the youth finally found their own space where they can express their talents. I now give the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, an Arabic speaking saying that your Arabic is impressive. That's a good note. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? If not, I will have a question to continue. Okay, we continued in our discussion. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned. Yes, please go ahead and ask your question. Can you unmute yourself, Khubayb?
Hi there. Good evening.
Good evening.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So my question is for Ambassador Shannon. When you mention, sorry, I mean, please forgive me for being blunt. I like to tackle problems head on. When you mention the October Revolution, or attempted revolution, and the calls for a new government, democracy, and the anti corruption in Iraq. What is Canada doing to further these goals of the Iraqis? As far as I know, Iraq has been, from working there for the past 2 years and living there, Iraq's situation has greatly degenerated from what it was, economically, politically, and as well as its military strength. Iraq used to have a decent military to protect its interests and borders. That no longer applies. Its economy is ruined. The Iraqi dinar is not what it was, and corruption is rampant. What is Canada doing to further to better the lives of the average Iraqi? Mafias and pretty much Iran pretty much run Iraq now.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think that's a blunt question. I think it's an honest question, and it's one that we ask ourselves. You know, why are we here? Why are we spending this much, you know, human capital and money trying to help Iraq stabilize itself and then make the transition from, you know, armed conflict to hopefully something better? You know, we look again at Iraq and we see a country with incredible potential. As I said, it's a middle-income country. It should not be the recipient of aid. It should be leading its own development. And so what's gone wrong that has created these dynamics? I mean, you're right. I think there's been a deterioration in the situation in the last few years. So, you know, my predecessor, who was here in 2018 and 2019, you know, he visited, I think, 15 of the 18 governorates in Iraq. I visited 2. You know, I've been to Baghdad and to Erbil, and that's it, because in the time that I've been here, we've either had a security crisis following the January events, you know, and even going back before then, it was very difficult to move around even in Baghdad because of all the violence that was being inflicted on protesters. And now, of course, we have COVID. So, I mean, these are circumstances that are pointing in the wrong direction. Obviously, the collapse of the price of oil is not something that anyone anticipated. And I think we're all trying to deal with it as best we can. You know, I talked about what Canada is doing. So what we're doing, as I said, it's one of the countries in which we have the highest level of investment, whether it's in terms of humanitarian assistance. So that's very much focused on the basic needs of people in the liberated areas. So mainly the governorates of Nineveh and Anbar. So helping displaced persons, including Yazidis, with, you know, things like basic health, you know, medicine, water, sanitation, etc., basic education. Make sure that women and girls have access to that, because, you know, a big part of Canada's focus in terms of development and humanitarian assistance is making sure that women and girls get equal access to that. As I said, we're heavily invested in, you know, diplomatically. So we've raised our presence in Erbil and Baghdad. We're trying to develop more and more commercial relations. So actually, in terms of money and in terms of, you know, people and you know, the number of people that we've deployed and human effort, we're doing quite a lot. I think what you're trying to get at is more diplomatically, you know, what are we doing to force, you know, Iraq in the right direction? And of course, that's a bit more difficult because, you know, we are here at the invitation of the Iraqis. You know, a large part of what we're doing, you referred to the weakening of the state and the weakening of Iraq's borders. You know, we are big players in the international coalition against Daesh. So we have people on the ground working with the Iraqi armed forces to help achieve the final defeat of Daesh. We're also in command of the NATO mission, which is meant to rehabilitate the Iraqi armed forces as an institution. So we're not training them how to fire guns. We're trying to basically reform them into a modern institution so that what happened in 2014 doesn't happen again the next time there's a need to confront an organization like Daesh. So we're trying to strengthen that as an institution. So again, we're heavily invested here, but you know, we have to deal with the government that's in place. You know, so when I arrived, it was the government of Mr. Abdel Mahdi, who had, you know, a perspective on the protests that was entirely negative. And so you had levels of violence that were being inflicted on protesters that we found outrageous. And so, you know, I spoke out against it. My minister spoke out against it. Our prime minister stood up in parliament and spoke against it. And we did a number of other things privately to apply pressure on the Abdel Mahdi government and to say, look, if we're spending all of this money and all of this human capital to help you, again, make that transition, you can't be doing things that deepen resentment and that make violence commonplace. That's just not acceptable. Obviously, now we have a new government under Prime Minister Kadhimi. I think he's someone with a very different perspective. He's extremely progressive on many things. I think he has genuine goodwill and good intentions when it comes to fighting corruption and to reforming the state. But he doesn't control everything. He's in a fairly weakened position. And so, part of what we're trying to do is to bolster his government a little bit so that they're able to face these challenges. But again, I mean, the questions that you asked are valid ones. And we continue to ask them, when we think about, are we here for the long term? Are we here for the medium term? We have to challenge ourselves with the kinds of questions that you've asked. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Sorry, Mr. Shannon.
Thank you.
One.
Mr. Kubayb, it's only one question now. Thank you for your understanding. We have only 10 minutes left, and I would like to invest this time to know more about how can we, in this very challenging time, predict the future of our countries, this expansion and exclusion of digital life. Now the world is facing a very serious problem, that one of the consequences of this problem of COVID-19 is that we have seen that the world is not working together as we thought. Many countries are working individually. There are many problems around all of this. We have also the rise of the identity issues again, because the online platforms have given a space for these issues to grow online. I mean, I know it's very hard to predict the future now, because what might we expect in 10 minutes might be completely different in the next 20 minutes. We know that one tweet could change the whole world. One tweet could change all our understanding of the future. But from your experience as a diplomat, a well-established diplomat, you mentioned the example of Egypt. I'm sure that you have learned lessons of how to predict the future in this sense, the social change. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to push toward this, but I'm really curious to hear from you. How would you predict our future in the next 10 years?
That's sick. Sorry, that's quite a rich question. I can't predict the future, but I think what's interesting for me, again, having seen how different governments handled COVID, and I think you're right, there was a bit of a tendency not to work together. It was interesting to see, I think authoritarian governments, by and large, did an especially poor job of it, whereas the democracies did okay. And I think what it emphasizes is the value of having a government that doesn't lie to its people. That it is key to building trust, so that when a government says, as in Canada, we need to go into lockdown, people need to disrupt their normal lives for weeks on end in order to contain a disease. There needs to be that level of trust that what we're being asked to do is based on legitimate, sound medical advice. And I think in societies where there is not that level of trust, where people are by nature suspicious of the government, or have learned to believe in conspiracy theories and things like that, there the social cohesion was a lot weaker, and therefore the impact of COVID was a lot more dramatic. So I think, it's simply going to continue to raise the stakes in terms of the accountability of governments, and again, those governments that don't tell the truth and that don't hold themselves accountable, I think are going to have a hard time dealing with the challenges of the future, whether it's global pandemic, whether it's climate change, which is a big issue for Canada. We're one of the only countries in the world that theoretically stands to benefit from global warming, because we're a cold piece of territory, and a warming Earth actually opens up agricultural space for us. But nonetheless, we see it as an extremely bad thing, a very negative thing. And so we've been, you know, among the leaders in working with small island states, for example, in the Pacific, who are at risk of disappearing completely within 20 years if sea levels continue to rise. So again, it's not that I'm not a pessimist at all. I tend to be an optimist by nature, but it's going to require, you know, governments that are guided by reason and by facts and by science. And as you've described, you know, the growing spread of, you know, online tools is really a double-edged sword. And I think it's going to challenge the younger generation to really develop a good judgment and an ability to see through and around propaganda, and to develop the appropriate respect for, you know, expertise such as it is, so that, you know, we can operate in the future across societies on the basis of a shared, you know, universe of facts that are agreed on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for all these rich points you have raised. I thank you for accepting to attend this event. We will have, not next week, but the week after, another event. It will be about reviving the Jewish memory of Mosul. We will host a Jewish Mosuli who is based in London. We have found the full record of that family back to the 17th century, and we will be presenting lots of materials about this family because the Jewish community was part of Iraq, and it's the time to, as I always advocate for diversity and inclusion. I am sure that you know, Mr. Ambassador, that diversity alone is not enough. It also requires inclusion. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for those who spared the time to attend this event. I wish you all remain safe. I hope you take care of yourself and also protect yourself, but most importantly, which is something I always say, do not only think about yourself, think about the elderlies, because they are most vulnerable to this corona. If we work all together, we will pass this too. Thank you so much, and see you in the next 2 weeks.
Shukran Azizi. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
شكرا سعادة السفير. تحياتي وإلى اللقاء.
تحياتي. سلامات.